For more than 4 centuries, the Lost Colony of Roanoke has existed in a strange space between history and legend. It is taught in classrooms, whispered in documentaries, and dramatized in novels as one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the early modern world. An entire English settlement, men, women, and children vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a single word carved into wood and a silence that has echoed since the late 16th century. For generations, historians believed that whatever truth existed had been erased by time itself, that the earth had swallowed its secrets, that the answers, if they ever existed, were gone forever. But history has a way of resisting closure. Today, as you watch this, something unprecedented is unfolding. In 2026, new forensic archaeological technologies that simply did not exist even a decade ago have reopened the case of Roanoke in ways no one anticipated. What was once speculation has begun to solidify into evidence. What was once dismissed as folklore is now being re-examined under the unforgiving lens of data, soil analysis, and genetic sequencing. And what is emerging from beneath the ground is not a simple explanation, not a comforting resolution, but a complex and deeply unsettling truth. This is not the story you think you know. For centuries, the dominant narrative has been deceptively simple. In 1587, an English colony was established on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Its governor, John White, returned to England for supplies. When he came back 3 years later, delayed by war and politics, the colony was gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no mass graves, just abandoned buildings and the word Croatoan carved into a post. From that single clue, countless theories were born. Assimilation, disease, starvation, violence, abandonment, and yet none of these theories ever fully worked. If the colonists had been massacred, where were the remains? If they had died of disease, why no burial sites? If they had assimilated, why no clear cultural or genetic record until now? For more than 400 years, the mystery endured, not because people stopped looking, but because the tools of the past were blunt. Archaeology relied on surface excavation, limited testing, and educated guesswork. DNA degraded too quickly to analyze. Subsurface imaging was crude. Context was inferred, not proven. Roanoke became a historical cold case, frozen in ambiguity. That changed in 2026. What makes this moment different is not a single discovery, but a convergence. Ground-penetrating radar capable of mapping subsurface anomalies with centimeter-level precision. Soil chemistry analysis that can identify human activity long erased from view. Forensic DNA extraction techniques that can recover genetic material from objects once thought biologically silent: clay pipes, leather fragments, even degraded wood. Together, these tools have transformed archaeology from an interpretive art into something closer to forensic science. And Roanoke, long believed to be archaeologically exhausted, has become the proving ground. The first step was not digging, but listening. Advanced ground-penetrating radar surveys were deployed across multiple sites tied to the original colony and its suspected migration routes. Unlike earlier scans, these systems did not simply detect objects. They identified patterns, disturbances in soil stratification consistent with human construction, repeated habitation, and, most disturbingly, organized burial activity in places where no record suggested people should have been. What the radar revealed immediately challenged the foundational assumption that the colonists disappeared in a single event. Instead, the subsurface data suggested phases: movement, resettlement, adaptation, and eventually collapse. Excavation followed, slow and deliberate. Each layer of soil was treated not as dirt, but as a timeline. The first artifacts recovered were mundane broken ceramics, iron fragments, domestic tools, but their locations told a different story. These objects were not scattered randomly, as one would expect from abandonment or sudden flight. They were clustered, reused, modified in ways that suggested prolonged survival beyond Roanoke Island itself. Then came the first discovery that changed everything. Buried beneath what radar had identified as a collapsed structure, archaeologists uncovered personal items unmistakably English in origin: buttons, beads, fragments of clothing fasteners, intermixed with materials traditionally associated with local indigenous communities. This was not evidence of conflict. It was evidence of entanglement, shared space, shared lives, and within those artifacts something else remained: trace biological material. Using next-generation DNA recovery methods, researchers extracted genetic fragments from residues embedded in porous surfaces sweated absorbed into leather, skin cells trapped in clay, organic fibers preserved by anaerobic soil conditions. Against all expectations, the samples were viable, partial, fragmented, but enough to begin comparison. What followed was one of the most controversial moments in modern archaeology. DNA markers recovered from Roanoke-era artifacts showed genetic signatures consistent not only with European ancestry, but with lineages still present in certain modern indigenous populations of the region. This was not theoretical assimilation, it was biological continuity. But the story did not end there. Additional samples, recovered from deeper layers, revealed something darker: evidence of malnutrition, signs of extreme physiological stress encoded in epigenetic markers. patterns consistent with famine conditions and prolonged hardship. These were not the remains of a thriving merged community. They were the remnants of people under relentless pressure, environmental, social, and political. As excavation expanded, the narrative grew more complex. Not all colonists followed the same path. The evidence suggested fragmentation. Small groups, splitting off, integrating to varying degrees, surviving for different lengths of time. Some adapted, some did not. Some disappeared from the record entirely. And then came the most unsettling discovery of all. In a remote inland site, far from Roanoke Island and previously dismissed as irrelevant, ground-penetrating radar identified an anomaly unlike any other. A pattern consistent with a mass interment but not a massacre. No weapon trauma. No signs of battle. Instead, a burial consistent with epidemic response. The soil told the story even when the bodies could not. Chemical signatures revealed elevated phosphate levels associated with human decomposition, arranged in deliberate rows. This was not chaos. It was order in the face of catastrophe. People burying their dead with intention, even as their world collapsed around them. Taken together, the evidence shattered the myth of sudden disappearance. The lost colony did not vanish, it endured, it adapted, it fractured, and ultimately it succumbed not to a single cause but to a convergence of forces no one alive at the time could fully control. Environmental instability, political isolation, cultural entanglement under stress, and the brutal arithmetic of survival in an unfamiliar land. Yet for all its tragedy, this story is not one of failure. It is a human story. Men and women refusing to surrender to oblivion. Parents protecting children. Communities forming across cultural boundaries. People making impossible choices in circumstances history rarely records with compassion. Roanoke's true legacy is not mystery, it is resilience. And in 2026, for the first time, that legacy is no longer hidden beneath speculation. It is emerging from the ground itself, piece by piece, genome by genome, forcing us to confront a truth far more complex and far more human than any legend ever allowed. This is only the beginning. What makes the discoveries of 2026 so disruptive is not just what they reveal, but how they force us to abandon a centuries-old habit of thinking about Roanoke as a single moment frozen in time. For generations, historians treated the colony's disappearance as an event, something that happened once, suddenly, and decisively. Either they were killed, or they left, or they blended in. One answer, one cause, one ending. But the ground does not tell stories in straight lines. As excavation continued across multiple sites, a new pattern emerged, one that could not be explained by a single theory or timeline. The colonists did not vanish together. They did not move as one. Instead, the archaeological record pointed toward a prolonged process, unfolding over months and years, shaped by choices, constraints, and evolving relationships with the land and its people. The first clue came from something deceptively small: changes in tool use. Among the artifacts recovered from inland sites were English tools that had been modified in distinctly non-European ways. Iron blades reshaped to match indigenous cutting techniques, domestic objects repurposed for hunting and foraging rather than farming, even fragments of armor reworked into utility items. These were not the marks of a community clinging to its old identity. They were signs of adaptation under pressure. This mattered because it contradicted the long-standing assumption that English colonists either maintained strict cultural boundaries or were immediately overwhelmed. Instead, the evidence suggested negotiation, learning, experimentation, a slow recalibration of survival strategies as familiar systems failed. Environmental data reinforced this conclusion. Soil core analysis conducted alongside the excavations revealed that the late 1580s and early 1590s coincided with one of the most severe drought periods in the region in the last 5 centuries. Tree ring data confirmed extended water scarcity, crop failures, and ecological instability. The land the colonists believed would sustain them simply could not. This reframed the entire context of Roanoke. The colony was not abandoned in isolation. It collapsed within a broader environmental crisis that also strained indigenous communities. Resources were scarce, tensions were inevitable. Cooperation, when it occurred, was not charity, it was mutual survival. And yet, cooperation alone was not enough. As archaeologists expanded their focus beyond Roanoke Island itself, they began identifying what researchers now describe as microsettlements, small, short-lived habitation zones scattered across the mainland. These sites lacked the permanence of villages or forts. Instead, they appeared temporary, used, abandoned, and sometimes reused by different groups over time. The implication was stark. The colonists were moving frequently, not as explorers, but as displaced people. Some groups appear to have attached themselves to indigenous settlements, integrating partially into existing social structures. Others remained more isolated, attempting to preserve English identity while adopting indigenous survival techniques. This fragmentation explains why earlier searches failed. Archaeologists were looking for a single destination when, in reality, there were many. But fragmentation has consequences. DNA analysis began to reveal uneven survival outcomes. In sites associated with stronger integration, genetic markers suggested intermarriage and continuity. In others, biological traces abruptly ended. No descendants, no further material culture, just silence. This raised an uncomfortable question: what happened to those who did not integrate? The answer began to emerge through forensic analysis of human remains recovered in secondary burial contexts. These were not mass graves in the conventional sense. They were small clusters, 2, 3, sometimes 4 individuals buried carefully, without signs of violence. Yet osteological analysis revealed indicators of chronic stress, weakened immune responses, nutritional deficiencies, and markers consistent with infectious disease. The colonists were dying slowly, not from a single epidemic sweeping through overnight, but from cumulative vulnerability. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Exposure increased susceptibility. Psychological stress, displacement, uncertainty, grief took its toll in ways no historical document could record. And still, they tried to maintain order. One of the most haunting aspects of the 2026 findings is evidence of ritual persistence. Despite their circumstances, the colonists continued to practice elements of English burial customs: body orientation, grave markers made from available materials, personal items placed with the dead. These were acts of identity preservation, carried out even when survival itself was uncertain. At the same time, indigenous burial practices appear alongside them, sometimes within the same site. This is not evidence of confusion, it is evidence of cultural blending at the most intimate level. Deaths force communities together in ways life could not. Yet this fragile coexistence was never stable. Political dynamics among indigenous groups, already complex before English arrival, were altered by scarcity and foreign presence. Alliances shifted. Tensions rose. Some groups may have viewed the colonists as asset sources of metal, knowledge, or trade. Others likely saw them as liabilities in an increasingly competitive landscape. The archaeological record reflects this instability. Habitation layers show abrupt abandonment without signs of struggle. Settlements dismantled rather than destroyed. Tools removed. Food stores emptied. These are not the signs of attack. They are the signs of flight. Flight from what? The evidence points toward a cascading crisis. Environmental collapse created scarcity. Scarcity intensified political competition. Political instability reduced tolerance for outsiders, and outsiders already weakened were forced to move again and again until there was nowhere left to go. One of the most controversial findings of 2026 involves what researchers refer to cautiously as external pressure. This does not imply a single enemy or event. Instead, it refers to overlapping forces beyond the immediate colonist-indigenous relationship. Spanish exploration activity further south. Regional trade disruptions, the spread of old-world pathogens moving faster than people could track. DNA recovered from burial sites shows genetic signatures of pathogens consistent with diseases known to have devastated populations in the Americas, following European contact. While definitive identification remains under review, the pattern is unmistakable. The colonists were not just victims of the New World, they were unwitting participants in a biological upheaval larger than themselves. This reframes the moral narrative as well. For centuries, Roanoke has been framed as either a cautionary tale of colonial arrogance or a mystery romanticized into abstraction. But 2026 discoveries resist both simplifications. They reveal colonists who were neither purely heroic nor purely destructive. They were human beings navigating forces far beyond their understanding. And they reveal indigenous communities not as passive backdrops but as active agents making decisions, forming alliances, and responding to catastrophe with their own strategies of survival. As these threads came together, historians began to realize that Roanoke was not an anomaly. It was an early example of a pattern that would repeat across the continent. Fragile settlements colliding with ecological limits, cultural misunderstanding, and unintended consequences. What makes Roanoke unique is not that it failed, but that it left no written ending. Until now, the soil, the artifacts, and the DNA are filling in what ink never recorded. They are telling a story that unfolds not in dramatic finales but in quiet attrition. A story of people adapting until adaptation was no longer enough. And as the evidence continues to emerge, one truth becomes increasingly clear. The lost colony of Roanoke was not lost in mystery, it was lost in time. As the evidence accumulated, something profound began to happen among the research teams working on the Roanoke sites. The mystery was no longer abstract. It was no longer about theories competing in books or documentaries. It was becoming intimate. Names that once existed only in faded records began to feel close. Lives that history had flattened into statistics regained weight, texture, and consequence. This shift occurred the moment DNA stopped being just data. In 2026, genetic analysis moved beyond identifying broad ancestry and entered a more sensitive phase: kinship reconstruction. By comparing DNA fragments extracted from artifacts and burial sites with each other and with modern genetic databases where consent and ethical protocols allowed, researchers began identifying familial relationships within the lost colony itself: parents, children, siblings. The realization was devastating. The colonists did not disperse as isolated individuals, they fractured as families. Some remained together. Others were separated by circumstance, geography, and survival choices that could not be coordinated. In several cases, DNA evidence suggests that members of the same family ended their lives in entirely different regions, integrated into different communities, or dying under different conditions. This fragmentation adds a deeply human dimension to the story. It forces us to imagine impossible decisions. Parents sending children to live with other groups in the hope they might survive. Adults staying behind to buy time. Families dissolving not from conflict, but from desperation. And yet, amid this loss, there is also evidence of continuity. In one particularly significant case, DNA markers recovered from a clay pipe fragment matched lineages found among present-day indigenous families in the region. This was not speculation or folklore. It was a genetic bridge spanning more than 4 centuries, a living connection between the lost colony and the modern world. This discovery reframes the idea of disappearance entirely. Roanoke did not vanish without descendants. Some of its people survived, not as English colonists, but as something new, members of blended communities shaped by necessity rather than ideology. Their identities evolved. Their stories were absorbed into oral traditions rather than written archives. History forgot them because it did not know how to recognize them. But genetics remembered. At the same time, other lines ended completely in some sites. DNA analysis revealed no continuation beyond a single generation. These were the people who did not adapt fast enough, or who encountered circumstances from which adaptation was impossible. Their stories ended quietly, without monuments, without records, buried in soil until technology could finally listen. The emotional weight of these findings cannot be overstated. Archaeologists are trained to maintain distance, to analyze rather than empathize. But Roanoke resists detachment. It confronts us with the raw vulnerability of early colonial life, stripped of triumphal narratives and reduced to human endurance. This is where the story takes its most unsettling turn. One of the most carefully studied sites revealed evidence not just of survival or death, but of social strain so severe that it altered behavior in measurable ways. Isotopic analysis of bones indicated sudden dietary changes inconsistent with long-term adaptation. These shifts suggest emergency consumption patterns, foods eaten not by choice but by necessity. Researchers are cautious in their language, but the implications are clear. Hunger pushed people beyond cultural norms. Survival demanded compromises that would have been unthinkable months earlier. This was not a community planning for the future. It was one struggling to make it through the next season. And yet, even here, there is no evidence of violence between colonists. No signs of internal collapse through conflict. Instead, the pressure came from outside and above: environmental, biological, and social forces converging relentlessly. This challenges one of the most persistent myths about Roanoke, that it ended in chaos. The archaeological record tells a different story. It shows restraint, it shows care, it shows people holding on to structure even as that structure failed them. Burial practices continued, tools were maintained, children were protected for as long as possible. In many ways, this makes the outcome even more tragic, because it means Roanoke did not fail due to incompetence or brutality. It failed because it was unsustainable. It existed at the edge of ecological tolerance, cultural understanding, and logistical support. When any one of those failed, the system might have adapted. When all failed together, collapse became inevitable. The role of external European powers adds another layer of complexity. Spanish activity in the broader region, while not directly linked to Roanoke, altered trade networks and power balances. The mere presence of European competition increased tension among indigenous groups, indirectly affecting how outsiders like the Roanoke colonists were perceived. In this sense, Roanoke was caught in the early shockwaves of globalization long before the word existed. Decisions made in distant courts and ports reverberated across oceans, shaping lives that those decision-makers would never know. This realization forces a re-evaluation of responsibility. For centuries, Roanoke has been framed as an English failure or an indigenous mystery. The 2026 evidence suggests something more uncomfortable. The colony was a casualty of systems larger than any single group. Empire, environment, disease, and displacement converged, and ordinary people paid the price. As historians absorbed these findings, debates reignited not about what happened, but about how history should be told. Roanoke is no longer a puzzle to be solved and shelved. It is a case study in complexity, in unintended consequences, in the limits of human planning, and perhaps most importantly, it is a reminder of how easily lives can vanish from the record without ever truly disappearing. The final phase of research focused on context rather than discovery. How should this story be communicated? How do you honor both the colonists and the indigenous communities without simplifying either? How do you avoid turning tragedy into spectacle? The answer, many researchers argue, lies in humility. Roanoke's true lesson is not about mystery, but about uncertainty, about the danger of assuming permanence in fragile systems, about the resilience required to adapt and the cost when adaptation fails. As the excavation teams prepared to conclude their work, one archaeologist reportedly said something that captures the spirit of 2026's breakthrough better than any technical report ever could. They weren't lost, she said. They were living, and then they were gone. And now, finally, they're being heard. The lost colony is no longer silent. But its voice does not offer comfort, it offers truth. When the final layers of soil were carefully returned to their place and the excavation sites fell silent, it became clear that the story of Roanoke was no longer unfinished, not in the way it once was. The mystery that had haunted centuries was not erased but transformed. It had moved from the realm of speculation into something far more difficult to confront, understanding. For generations, the lost colony of Roanoke existed as a question mark in the margins of history, a curiosity, a legend, a riddle passed down because it resisted answers. But what the discoveries of 2026 reveal is that Roanoke was never truly unknowable, it was simply unheard. Its evidence was always there, waiting for a time when humanity would finally have the patience and the humility to listen. What emerges from this breakthrough is not a single dramatic revelation, but a layered truth. A truth that resists simplicity. The colonists did not disappear in the night. They did not fall to one enemy or one mistake. They endured, they adapted, they fractured, and eventually they were absorbed by forces larger than themselves. This is what makes the story so unsettling. There is no villain to point to, no final battle, no moment where everything collapses at once. Instead, Roanoke fades through exhaustion, through hunger, through separation, through the slow erosion of certainty. It is a reminder that history is often shaped not by dramatic endings, but by quiet attrition. And yet, within that attrition there is dignity. The archaeological record shows people who refused to surrender their humanity even as their circumstances stripped away comfort, identity, and hope. They buried their dead with care. They protected their children as long as they could. They learned new ways to live when old ways failed. They reached across cultural boundaries not out of idealism, but necessity. In doing so, they became part of something larger than England, larger than Roanoke Island, larger than the labels history later imposed on them. The DNA evidence forces us to acknowledge this continuity. Some descendants of the lost colony are not lost at all. They live on in modern communities whose ancestors absorbed, protected, and remembered them in ways European history never recorded. Their survival challenges the notion that disappearance equals erasure. History forgot them, people did not. This reframes the legacy of Roanoke in a profound way. It is no longer a symbol of failure or mystery. It is a testament to the complexity of early contact, where cultures collided not in neat narratives of conquest or collapse, but in tangled realities of cooperation, tension, and survival. The discoveries of 2026 also force a broader reckoning with how history is written. For centuries, absence of evidence was treated as evidence of absence. If something could not be easily found, it was assumed not to exist. Roanoke reminds us that the ground remembers what documents forget and that truth often waits for technology to catch up with it. But technology alone did not solve this mystery. What truly changed in 2026 was perspective. Archaeologists stopped looking for a single answer and began listening for many voices. Historians stopped asking what happened and began asking how did it unfold. Scientists stopped treating DNA as a tool for classification and started using it as a bridge between past and present. This shift is what allowed Roanoke to speak, and what it says is uncomfortable. It tells us that survival does not guarantee remembrance, that people can live full lives and still vanish from written history, that systems, political, environmental, economic, and fail ordinary people without anyone intending harm, and that the consequences of those failures echo for centuries. Roanoke is no longer just about the past, it is about us. In a world facing climate instability, mass displacement, and cultural friction, the story of the lost colony feels disturbingly familiar. It warns us that adaptation has limits, that cooperation is fragile under pressure, and that ignoring complexity in favor of comforting myths only delays understanding. Yet it also offers something else. It offers empathy. By seeing the colonists not as symbols but as people, we are reminded that history is not made by abstractions. It is made by individuals making choices under constraints they did not create. The men and women of Roanoke were not pioneers in a grand narrative. They were parents, children, workers, believers trying to survive in a world that offered no guarantees. Their story deserves more than mystery. It deserves memory. As research continues beyond 2026, Roanoke will no longer be treated as an anomaly. It will be studied as part of a broader pattern of early colonial interaction, environmental stress, and human resilience. New sites may yet be found, new connections uncovered, new descendants identified, but the core truth will remain. The lost colony did not vanish, it transformed, and that transformation, once invisible, is now written into the soil, the artifacts, and the DNA of living people. The past is no longer silent. It is speaking clearly if we are willing to listen without expecting easy answers. So the next time the name Roanoke is spoken, it should not be whispered like a ghost story. It should be spoken with respect, with nuance, with an understanding that mystery is not always about what is missing, but about what we have not yet learned to see. History did not lose Roanoke, we did, and in 2026, we finally found it again. If this story changed the way you see the past, take a moment to reflect on it. Share your thoughts, question the narratives you were taught, and remember that history is not finished, it is constantly being rewritten by those willing to look deeper, because the ground still holds many stories, and some of them are waiting for us.